Hi, I'm Tom Eschen, and this is Power and Politics. Our conversations continue today with Rob Hayes, the Director of Clean Water and Environmental Advocates, on the heels of an enacted and adopted New York State budget. He talks about the advantages of that budget, where money's going, and also what money they wanted but didn't get, especially in light of some cutbacks coming at the federal level from the EPA. He also discusses the PFA issue and where they are in that, and lead pipe replacement, if municipalities have enough money to be able to facilitate the replacement of those pipes right now of that aging infrastructure in many cities throughout the state of New York. Of course, you can listen wherever you get your podcast, so subscribe today at Power and Politics, or you can watch on YouTube at CBS 6 Albany. Rob Hayes joins us now, the Director of Clean Water and Environmental Advocates New York. Rob, we really appreciate your time. Thanks for coming in.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
We thought it was really timely, a lot going on right now at the local, state, federal level when it comes to clean water and the environment, I guess as a whole you could say. Let's start with the budget process in terms of what you wanted to see and what actually got done there in this year's New York State budget.
You know, at a time when we're facing unprecedented threats from the federal government to the environment, New York was able to make progress in this budget to protect clean water, clean air, and healthy communities. There was new funding for water infrastructure, upgrades for open space protection, as well as some money for electrification and other climate actions. But at the same time, this was all overshadowed by some missed opportunities. You know, earlier this year, Governor Hochul backtracked on a commitment to establish a clean air initiative, which would raise billions of dollars for climate projects and to help New Yorkers afford their energy bills. So there has to be more action in Albany on the environment before the legislature adjourns this year.
These steps that you say that were taken moving forward, I guess, I mean, you talk about things being tied to inflation all the time in the economy of, you know, how are you keeping up with inflation? How did these steps keep up with some of the, I guess you could say from your standpoint, some of the steps backward from the federal government? I guess where does this put the state knowing what could be coming down the line here?
Yeah, environmental funding did increase in the budget. We got another $500 million to upgrade water infrastructure, another $425 million for the Environmental Protection Fund. These increases weren't as big as we were looking for. You know, there's a lot of projects that are oversubscribed in these programs, or that money could do a lot more good. But we're very, very worried at what's coming down from the federal government. We've seen in the Trump budget that he essentially wants to eliminate clean water funding from the federal government. That would cause huge problems here in New York in terms of communities' ability to upgrade aging and failing drinking water and wastewater infrastructure. So as we're facing those threats from the federal government, New York has to step up and do more.
What kind of explanation does an organization like yours get for that, if you're able to get one, either from someone that supports that kind of move or even someone from that administration or beyond?
You know, what we've heard from the federal government is that they want to put more of these costs on the states, right? That this isn't the federal government's issue, this is the state's issue. But at the end of the day, if you're cutting all of this federal funding, that's going to mean more costs for New Yorkers. If water utilities have to raise rates to fund a new water main or a new treatment plant, that's going to directly hit New Yorkers in their pockets at their water bills. That's what we need to avoid, and that's why everyone should be pushing back against these cuts from the Trump administration.
And like you said, some of that has to be then backfilled in the state budget, which depending on how it looks, I know that the governor and legislators say, well, we have to come back in the fall to be able to try and backfill, though they keep on saying no one can backfill. You go from that level down to the local level. What do the municipalities say about this funding? Because I know that this is a part of lead pipe replacement projects. Federal dollars are so important when it comes to that. What are they experiencing right now in this scheme and in this dynamic?
Local governments love clean water funding. It helps them afford these really essential improvements to drinking water and wastewater infrastructure systems. You know, most communities can't afford that on their own to pay $20 or $30 million to completely overhaul their water treatment plant. You know, that plant is now 50 or 60 years old. It's getting close to being out of date. Without that aid, local governments simply can't make these improvements to stop sewage overflows, to prevent boil water orders, do all the things that we need to protect clean water.
And I think, you know, there's different few aspects in there. The funding, is it enough right now, as at the end of the day, to be able, I think 2037 was the federal mandate, right, to be able to get rid of all these lead pipes. It was $5 billion, I should say, to be able to do all of that. Where are we? I know that you were very active in Troy when a lot of that was going out in terms of trying to canvass and find out where it is. Can you put anywhere on the spectrum where that is at?
Lead pipes are still a huge problem across New York. We have one of the highest numbers in the nation of these dangerous pipes. And we do not have nearly enough money to dig them all out of the ground. We've got some money from the federal bipartisan infrastructure law, but that runs out in just a few years. Governor Hochul now has the opportunity to step up and do more. There's a lot of money for clean water in the budget, like what we were saying. The governor could snap her fingers tomorrow and put that towards lead pipe replacement, and that has to happen.
I know specifically in Troy, we had spoken a lot with the new mayor about this in terms of, and also just the dynamic of their city of trying to unlock that money, trying to get a contractor to do so. How much is that an issue here? How much is that a part of this process?
You know, we see lead pipe replacements as an opportunity on multiple fronts. It's an opportunity to protect water quality. It's also an opportunity to create thousands of good paying union jobs to do this work. We know that the contractors are eager and available to do it. Some communities have raised concerns about the constitutionality of replacing privately owned lead pipes, but we've heard from the Comptroller's office and others, communities have the green light to do this work. They need to get the work crews out on the street to do it.
Why should people be incentivized to do it, especially at the private level?
Well, you know, we do not want these costs falling on private homeowners. You know, most of these lead pipes are located in disadvantaged communities and low-income communities. Folks living in those places don't have $5,000 to $10,000 to dig up a pipe that they didn't put in the ground. So this should be the responsibility of the water utility to get these pipes out, and therefore the responsibility of the state and federal government to get the water utilities the resources they need to do it.
What kind of lessons have you learned, not just in New York, not just in this region, nationally? I've said it before on this program. I asked that out because I worked in Flint, Michigan, and during the peak of the water crisis there. And obviously the circumstances there were a little bit different and people don't really know the full story. They changed the water source, water came through, and I'm sure you probably know this story really well. The water was bad, it leached the pipes, and the pipes were ruined forever. So there was a consistent flow of lead. Is that a lesson, I guess, do you think that should be, what are the lessons you learned from that maybe apply to situations like this?
You know, one of the big lessons is don't wait for a crisis to happen to fix a problem. You know, we want to replace all these lead pipes before people get sick, not afterwards. And so, you know, there is no safe level of lead exposure, no safe level of lead in drinking water. So removing lead pipes, replacing lead pipes has to be a top priority to protect clean water in New York.
We talk about, you mentioned maybe some private resistance that could be there. Is it political will a part of that? And what do you do to kind of gain some support there? When it comes to unlocking more funding and stepping up in this case?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, there's been a lot of money invested in clean water in recent years. I think we're up to $6 billion now. The problem is very little of that has gone towards lead pipe replacement. Governor Hochul hasn't felt that political pressure to really invest to get the lead out of drinking water. But really, she should be doing this. It's very, very popular. Poll after poll, you ask New Yorkers, do you support clean water? Do you want to get the lead out of drinking water? 70, 80, 90% of folks are saying, yes, absolutely, protect my drinking water.
And there's compelling stories to tell there. I mean, you have children that are impacted, of course, in this case, and I think a parent wants to prevent that, right, at the end of the day. And then that's kind of the story I'm sure that has to be told to be able to garner some movement here.
Yeah, absolutely. We've worked with a lot of folks in Troy, mothers of children who were lead poisoned by the water in their tap, and that should never be the case. No mother, no person should have to worry that when they turn on the tap, what comes out isn't safe to drink. That's why we have to be proactive when we're addressing these threats.
Well, we talked about resistance to initiatives like this. I did want to get to the Business Council filing, I think it was a lawsuit or something to be, and they were among other organizations, I should preface by saying that. There was a group of organizations looking at the New York's new wetland regulations, and they argue that, you know, this is that's too broad of a definition. The process in which they went through to be able to implement this was incorrect. What is your reaction to that resistance to expanding what is considered a wetland in New York State?
First of all, this is a frivolous lawsuit. The regulations that the Department of Environmental Conservation put in place adhere to the law. They're good regulations. And at the end of the day, they're going to protect over 1 million acres of wetlands across the state. That's going to help filter our drinking water. That's going to help prevent flooding. These are good things that New Yorkers need, especially as the climate crisis worsens. So we're very hopeful, and we expect that the court will rule on the behalf of the department and make sure that these wetland regulations stay in place.
One of their arguments was in regards to what is considered an urban, I guess, area. And they're saying, well, Corinth in Saratoga County, why is that considered an urban environment? What would be your response to that?
It's really important to protect wetlands everywhere, but especially in areas where there has been development, because there just isn't as much open space to soak up the water when it rains. And so, in those urban areas, that's where there's more prevalence of flooding and potential risk of property damage. So protecting even small wetlands in urban areas, even if they're smaller urban areas, is really, really critical to prevent all that property damage.
What do you make also of their argument that it's such a wide-ranging, use their definition, it's such a wide-ranging regulation that it's impacting the addition of housing in New York State and the development there?
There are lots of places where we can be building housing in a sustainable way, in doing more infill development, in building more where there already is development. We do not want to put our drinking water at risk by doing excessive and overdevelopment. And that's exactly how this proposal and these regulations are structured. They're intended to protect really essential wetlands from overdevelopment, not the development that we really need.
Let's get back to the budget, just with some policy things that you were looking for might be in the future. I know PFAS was something that was on your docket. Policy-wise, where are we in the state after this fiscal year 2026 comes out?
There's still a lot of legislation that we need the state legislature to pass before they adjourn in about 5 weeks. Top of the list is some legislation to ban PFAS chemicals in products. Many of your listeners are probably familiar with PFAS. They've polluted drinking water across New York. They're known as forever chemicals because they persist in the environment for so long. But right now, many manufacturers, many industries are still putting PFAS in their products. And as long as they're doing that, we're going to continue to see drinking water contamination. So banning them in these products is on the top of the list this year.
And I'm sure, like we spoke about the federal government in this light, and you look at some of the moves made even within the last few months. Supreme Court, even I think that was even before the Trump. That was right around the time of the change in power. The Chevron decision, and then you also had, I believe it was the Biden administration had put forth limits for federal to be able for companies to put PFAS into, I guess what's the federal limits on PFAS and be into water systems. So that has been drawn back as well. Are those things that also, I guess, concern you when it comes to New York's action when it comes to this?
We have not seen the Trump administration take a single pro-environmental action. Instead, they are trying to obliterate the EPA. They're trying to kill our offshore wind industry. And now they're threatening our drinking water by threatening to roll back really critical standards on PFAS chemicals. So all of this means that we need New York to step up and be an environmental leader, because we're not going to get it from the federal government. Governor Hochul, the State Department of Health, if the Trump administration rolls back protections for PFAS in our drinking water, we need them to stand up and say, no, we're not going to do that here in New York. We're going to keep moving forward.
And one of the initiatives that I thought was interesting was the wells, a private well, and the PFAS that could be there, and what New York and how you're able to, like we talked about before, of getting a homeowner, a resident, a property owner to be able to work, with the state or someone else to be able to have this information out there. Why is that so important for you?
This was one of the hidden gems of the state budget. There's new language in there authorizing state funds to be used to help test for and remediate private wells contaminated by PFAS chemicals. You've got a lot of rural New Yorkers that have PFAS in their water but don't have the thousands of dollars needed to either install filtration technology or hook up to a public water system. That state support is going to be really critical to helping those vulnerable New Yorkers get clean water.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, that does take up a piece of this pie, right? How much of that pie?
Yep.
In terms of PFAS and the issue there.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a huge problem across the state. This investment that we're making in the budget, I think to the tune of about $15 million to help with private wells, that's just the first step. There is going to have to be future funding in future budgets to continue addressing this problem, because at the end of the day, we can't allow any PFAS in drinking water. The US EPA has been clear. There is no safe level of PFAS exposure. We have to protect drinking water from these chemicals.
Anything else from the budget that you liked or didn't like?
We did see $1 billion for climate action in the budget that the governor proposed and the legislature agreed to. But at the end of the day, $1 billion is still short of the billions that would have been raised by that clean air initiative that the governor delayed earlier this year. We have to see her move forward with cap and invest regulations this year if we're going to meet our climate goals going forward.
That's been something just hanging, I guess you could say, for years now, right? I know that it was sort of, there was pieces of it that had tried to be implemented, but no money was put in the pot. Why do you think there's resistance there?
Well, this is the big question. How are we going to meet our climate goals here in New York? How are we going to move to a fossil-free future? And we're not going to get there without this clean air initiative, also known as the Cap and Invest program. But we know there's a lot of opposition out there from the oil and gas industry. They prefer the status quo. They prefer continuing to make enormous profits while New Yorkers suffer the consequences of more extreme heat and more extreme flooding. We're saying that status quo is unacceptable. We have to transition to a renewable future.
I know the Climate Change Superfund Act was a part of holding them accountable, right? And seeing that move forward, does that help at the end of the day? Like you said, for those that could be responsible for this?
It should help. That's going to take time to go through the courts. And even now, we're facing a threat from the Trump administration, who's suing New York to try and overturn that law. This is, again, where New York has to stand up and say, no, we're going to hold the oil and gas industry accountable, even if the Trump administration is cozying up to them.
Rob Hayes, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. Hit the subscribe button right now so you can stay up to date on these news-making conversations about the issues impacting New Yorkers the most: power and politics.